life sciences is a very broad discipline. Let's slice and dice it for the benefit of our audience.
Okay, it's a tough question, but let's give it a shot. So there are ways to classify it at, for example, the length scale of what you're studying, right?
Okay.
So let's try that, right? So there are people who study the molecules that make up all living things.
Okay.
Proteins, DNA, and RNA, and things like that, right? So molecular biology. And there are people who study the structures of these molecules. And this end of the discipline is very, very close to physics and chemistry. And it involves a huge amount of very sophisticated experiments to determine protein structures and so on. And in fact, the biggest breakthrough in AI in terms of impact on biology happens at this end of the spectrum.
Sure.
AlphaFold, which is now able to give reasonable guesses about what a protein structure will look like just from the sequence. Then there are people who study how these proteins act together in systems that work inside a cell.
Okay.
And so I work in sort of that kind of area. What goes on inside a cell? How do all these active processes work to allow a cell to replicate efficiently or to find food and to optimize its metabolism and so on? So these are like networks of proteins. And so people who work on that will be considered sort of cell biologists. And subsets of cell biology will be, stem cell biology or microbiology. It depends which species you're studying, right?
Sure.
And people who study signaling networks are sort of halfway between cell biology and molecular biology. There's that group. Then there's the level of tissues. And this applies to multicellular organisms like us, animals or plants. We actually start life as single cells, but then develop into this beautiful macroscopic structure. So how do individual cells grow, divide, coordinate, and shape themselves and specialize to create a whole organism? And that entire field is called developmental biology, the development of an organism. It is a very, very large field. This field begins to touch upon also issues of human development. What are the errors that can happen when organisms develop and so on?
Just to go back, the first two, molecular biology and cell biology, are more or less organism or species agnostic, or is there a species?
That's a very good question. So it's one of the huge discoveries of biology that at the very, very at the level of DNA and proteins and so on, biology is universal, absolutely universal. I can take a piece of DNA from a human and I can put it in a bacterial cell, and with very few modifications, it will express and potentially do something.
Wow.
So it didn't have to be this way, but it turns out that all life uses a common language of the genetic code, the amino acid code, a certain way of making proteins. So at that level, biology is universal. At the level of cells, it is also one of the major discoveries in biology that the organization of cells, there are only 3 different major categories. They're called archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes. We are examples of eukaryotes. So there is a universality to studying biology at the level of a cell. If I study one eukaryotic cell, I can extrapolate what I do to most eukaryotic cells. Not all. There are always exceptions. But you can make general statements and then you can classify the exceptions. When you get to development, it is very, very species specific. But of course, there are commonalities. You've seen the famous pictures of the embryo of a chick and a rat and a human and even a fish. And at a certain stage in development, they will all look very, very similar. But before and after, they'll look very different. And beyond that, of course, it becomes very, very, very species specific.
Sure.
And this is one of the difficulties, right? You do experiments where you take a drug, which looks very promising in the lab, and you test it on rodents, and it looks, again, good. When you test it on humans, it doesn't work at all. So when it comes to, for example, applying biology discoveries to human health, the species differences become quite relevant. I'll just use this point to say that in the 20th century, there was starting from the beginning of the 20th century, there was the idea that the earlier approach to biology, which is studying anything you saw, just study the organisms around you, and whatever it was, geographically very different, and just capture insights from all that, yielded to a different way of doing biology, where people said, let's now focus our efforts into a few, what came to be called model organisms.